Chapter 22 of Napoleon I, An Intimate Biography, by Walter Geer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 22. 1815 to 1821. Saint Helena. On the Sunday after the Battle of Waterloo, the 25th of June, Napoleon left his capital for the last time and went to Malmaison. Here he remained for 4 days in a state of indecision very foreign to his usual character. But the Allies were fast approaching Paris, and he was forced to leave. On Thursday, for the first time in many years, he put on civilian dress, and said adieu to his mother and Queen Hortense. On the lawn at Malmaison a stone still marks the spot where he entered the carriage that was to bear him away to exile. That night at the Château of Rambouillet he slept for the last time beneath a palace roof. The next day he proceeded by way of Tours to the naval port of Rochefort. Here he hoped to find a vessel to take him to the United States, his chosen place of refuge, but he found the harbor blockaded by the British fleet. Even to the last the "wooden walls" of England were to prove an obstacle which he could not overcome. Joseph offered him the cabin which he had engaged aboard an American ship sailing from Bordeaux, but Napoleon refused to secure his own safety at the expense of his brother's. Finally he decided to surrender to Great Britain, and throw himself on the mercy of his most bitter foe. On the 14th of July, the national fête day, he went aboard the Bellerophon, which immediately set sail for England. After a slow voyage of a week, the vessel dropped anchor in the lovely harbor of Torbay, which Napoleon said reminded him of Porto Ferrajo. 2 days later the captain received orders to proceed to Plymouth. After 4 days of suspense in the harbor there, Admiral Lord Keith arrived with an order that "General Bonaparte" should be conveyed to the island of Saint Helena. The government allowed the captive to choose 3 officers and a physician to accompany him. Napoleon selected Bertrand, Montelon, and Gourgaud for his companions in exile, and Lacasse was added to the number in the coveted post of secretary. The Bellerophon then sailed for Torbay, where the Emperor and his suite were transferred on the 7th of August to a newer ship, the Northumberland, which had been chosen for the voyage. At this time Bertrand asked that O'Meara, the surgeon of the Bellerophon, be designated to accompany the Emperor in place of the physician originally selected, and the admiral consented to the change. During the voyage Napoleon passed most of his days in his cabin, where he at once began to dictate his recollections to Lacasse. He dined every day with the admiral and the ship's officers, with whom he conversed freely. In the evening he played cards or chess in the general cabin. After a voyage of 67 days, the exiles sighted the frowning cliffs of Saint Helena, that black wart rising out of the ocean. After dark the next day, the 17th of October, Napoleon landed, and passed the night at a house prepared for his reception at Jamestown. On the morrow he was up at dawn, and rode with Admiral Cockburn and Bertrand to Longwood, which had been selected for his residence. Napoleon seemed satisfied with the arrangement, and expressed a desire to occupy the house as soon as it could be altered for his occupancy. In the meantime he took up his abode for 7 weeks in a little bungalow near the town, named the Briars. A more solitary, out-of-the-way place than Saint Helena could not have been chosen for the captive eagle. The island is only 10 miles by 7 in dimensions, and its population at the time was less than 3,000, only a quarter of whom were white. It lies almost in the middle of the South Atlantic, 1,700 miles east of Brazil, and 1,200 miles west of the mouth of the Congo, nearly 4,000 miles from the Strait of Gibraltar. "And where, may I ask," says the apologetic Mr. Rose, "could a less unpleasant place of detention have been found? In Europe he must inevitably have submitted to far closer confinement. The Tower of London, the Eyrie of Dumbarton Castle, even Fort William itself, were named as possible places of detention. Were they suited to the child of the Mediterranean? He needed sun, he needed exercise, he needed society. All these he could have on the plateau of Longwood, in a singularly equable climate, where the heat of the tropics is assuaged by the southeast trade wind, and plants of the subtropical and temperate zones alike flourish." It was December, and the tropical summer had come before the Emperor took up his residence in his final home at Longwood. For the former proprietor of so many sumptuous palaces, his generous host, the British nation, had provided as an abode an old one-story cow stable which had been remodeled for his residence. From the porch one entered a fair sized billiard room, and passed through into the salon, beyond which was the dining room, lighted only by a glass door. Opening out of this room, on the left was the library, and on the right Napoleon's private suite, comprising a study, bedroom, and bath. The landscape was as bare and dreary as the house. To the south, beyond the barren plateau, with its gnarled and stunted gum trees, lay the boundless expanse of the Atlantic. In all other directions the eye rested only on the scant verdure of the valleys, or the bleak walls of the mountains. Such was the earthly paradise which Mr. Rose so eloquently describes. Unfortunately, Napoleon's household at Longwood was hardly more congenial than the surroundings of the island. The personages of this long tragedy are few in number, and of some of them we catch only occasional glimpses. Bertrand, the former Marechal du Palais, and aide de camp of the Emperor, was an engineer officer of distinction. He was devoted to his master, and not less devoted to his wife. He possessed the singular distinction among the companions of the Emperor of being the only one who did not write a book. This in a way is to be regretted, for except Montholon he is the only one who stayed till the end, and of the last 3 years of Napoleon's life we know but little. In his loyal silence he remains the most sympathetic figure of the Emperor's entourage. Madame Bertrand was the daughter of Arthur Dillon, colonel of the Dillon regiment, celebrated in the history of France. By his first marriage he had one daughter who married the Marquis de la Tour du Pin, and was the author of the interesting Recollections of the Revolution and the Empire. After the death of his wife, Dillon married a widow, Madame de la Touche, a first cousin of the Empress Josephine. When Fanny Dillon was 23 years of age, in 1808, the Emperor himself arranged her marriage with his favorite aide de camp, who was 12 years her senior. She was a most engaging, fascinating woman, with something of the Creole charm of Josephine. She spoke English with perfect fluency. At Plymouth she entreated her husband not to follow Napoleon to Saint Helena, made a scene in his cabin, and then attempted to drown herself. After this first tumult of Creole passion she seems to have become reconciled to her lot. She won the regard and goodwill of all who knew her, and was the peacemaker of the little community. One trait of humor is recorded of her. At Saint Helena a child was born to her, whom she presented to the Emperor as "the first French visitor who had entered Longwood without Lord Bathurst's permission." Of the personality of Monsieur and Madame de Montholon we catch but a faint view at Saint Helena. He had known Napoleon ever since he was a child, when he went to Corsica with his mother and his stepfather, Monsieur de Sémonville. He was afterwards at school in Paris with Jérôme and Eugène de Beauharnais. It was his strange fate to share for 6 years the exile of the great Emperor, and then 20 years later, after the fiasco of Boulogne, to share for the same period of time, in the fortress of Ham, the imprisonment of his nephew, the future Napoleon III. After the departure of Lacaze, he succeeded to the vacant place of secretary, and became the most necessary member of the Emperor's staff. He wished, however, to accompany his wife when she left in 1819, and only remained at the urgent request of Napoleon. Of his wife we know but little. Curiously enough, her marriage with Montholon had at one time been forbidden by the Emperor, because she had 2 divorced husbands living, but he was afterwards tricked into giving his consent to Montholon's marriage with the niece of the President Geer, without realizing that the bride was the same woman under another description. Lacaze had had a very checkered career. In his youth he had entered the French navy, and had risen to the command of a brig. At the beginning of the Revolution he was among the first to emigrate. After the 18 Brumaire he returned to France, and became a Councillor of State. At the time of the Restoration he retired to England, but again returned to France during the 100 Days, and after Waterloo besought Napoleon to take him to Saint Helena. Born 3 years before the Emperor, he survived him by 21. With him was his son, then a boy, who in 1840 returned with the expedition to bring back Napoleon's remains. He afterwards became a senator under the Second Empire. Gourgaud was born in 1783 at Versailles, where his father was a musician at the Royal Chapel. At a very early age he entered the army, and fought with distinction in all the campaigns of the Empire, from Austerlitz to Waterloo. For exceptional services in Russia he received the title of Baron. During the 100 Days he was named general and aide de camp by the Emperor. After the battle of Waterloo he returned with Napoleon to Paris, and accompanied him to Rochefort and England, and became one of his companions in exile. At Longwood his extreme vanity soon brought him into collision with Lacaze and Montelon. Tiring of the life of Saint Helena, he returned to England. In 1840 he was a member of the party which brought back the remains of the Emperor. He died in 1852, on the eve of the proclamation of the Second Empire, but his Journal de Saint Helene was not published until 1899. In the opinion of Lord Rosebery, the one capital and supreme record of the life at Saint Helena is the private journal of Gourgaud, written for his own eye, without flattery or even prejudice, almost brutal in its raw realism. He alone of all the chroniclers strove to be accurate, and on the whole succeeded. His portrait of Napoleon is the most pleasing which exists. But the curse of his life was his jealous temperament, which rendered him an impossible companion, and made Napoleon glad to get rid of him. He quarreled with everybody, the Emperor included. By all who knew him, and did not have to live with him, he was highly esteemed; but in the little community at Longwood he was out of place. What makes Gourgaud's book profoundly interesting and valuable is the new and interesting view it affords of Napoleon's real character. We are apt to think of him as selfish and domineering; but in this record we see a new Napoleon, strange and contrary to our ideas, a Napoleon such as few but Rapp have hitherto presented to us. Rapp, the most independent and unflattering of all Napoleon's generals, and who, as his aide de camp, was constantly at his side, says: "Many people describe Napoleon as a harsh, violent, passionate man. It is because they never knew him. Absorbed as he was in his affairs, opposed in his plans, hampered in his projects, his humor was sometimes impatient and fluctuating; but he was so good and so generous that he was soon appeased." Says the Emperor's private secretary: "I always found him kind, patient, indulgent." Many other testimonies of the same kind might be quoted. Gourgaud unconsciously depicts Napoleon as gentle, patient, good tempered, trying to soothe his touchy and morbid attendant with something like the tenderness of a kind parent for a wayward child. No one at Saint Helena had more to endure than the Emperor, who was so little trained to patience, and few men would have borne his trials so well. The book of Lacaze, first published in 8 volumes, and subsequently in abridged form under the title of Memorial of Saint Helena, had a very large circulation. It is alleged to have been written from day to day, and to give an exact report of Napoleon's conversations. When corroborated by other evidence it may be considered a faithful transcript, but its value is much impaired by the number of spurious documents which it contains. Hardly one of these is genuine, and it has always been a mystery where he obtained them. Certainly not from the Emperor, for it is known that at the time he left Paris he confided to his brother Joseph the letters which he considered the most important. They were bound in volumes. It was chiefly to Montelon that Napoleon dictated the notes on his career which form so interesting, though not always trustworthy, a commentary on the events of the first part of his life. While Lacaze left the island in November, 1816, and Gourgaud in January, 1818, Montelon remained till the end. His memoirs were published in 2 volumes at Paris in 1847, under the title of Récit de la captivité de l'Empereur Napoléon à Sainte Hélène. The book is so interesting that it is a matter of regret that it was not published in its entirety. As it stands there are obvious suppressions, due no doubt to the author's veneration for Napoleon's memory and solicitude for the political fortunes of his nephew. For the final days of the Emperor we have no chronicles except those of Antomarchi, the least reliable of them all. He was a young Corsican surgeon of some reputation, and arrived at Saint Helena 18 months before Napoleon's death. He did not get on well with the Emperor, who considered him too young and inexperienced. He certainly made a wrong diagnosis of Napoleon's case, and treated him for a liver trouble which he considered trifling. He rendered one service, however, which almost makes up for his mendacious book. He took a cast of Napoleon's face after his death. The original of this, now at Brussels, represents the exquisite and early beauty of the countenance, when illness had transmuted passion into patience, and when death, with its last serene touch, had restored the regularity and refinement of youth. Of O'Meara's Voice from Saint Helena, the less said the better. Unknown to Napoleon, the man was the confidential agent of Lowe, and his book is so obviously tainted as to be worthless. The years spent at Saint Helena were of immense service to the Napoleonic tradition. Most historians seem to regard the 100 Days as a mere epilogue to the great drama of the First Empire's fall, not realizing that it was in point of fact a prologue to the strange romance of the rise of the Second Empire. This attitude is revealed in the most interesting English study of Napoleon's captivity at Saint Helena. To Lord Rosebery that captivity is "the last phase," and nothing more. But the importance of this phase cannot be rightly appreciated if we overlook the constructive work of Napoleon during his captivity. Saint Helena saw not only the end of a great career, but the beginning of a great creation. It was the scene not merely of the death of Napoleon, but of the birth of the Napoleonic legend. It is impossible even after the lapse of a century to speak in terms of moderation of England's treatment of Napoleon. Lord Rosebery says, "Were it possible, we would ignore all this literature, as it is peculiarly painful for an Englishman to read. He must regret that his government ever undertook the custody of Napoleon, and he must regret still more that the duty should have been discharged in a spirit so ignoble, and through agents so unfortunate." The delicate post of Governor of Saint Helena during Napoleon's captivity was entrusted to Sir Hudson Lowe, a narrow, ignorant man without a vestige of tact or sympathy. He was in no sense of the word a gentleman. Although his intentions may have been good, he was in every way unfitted for the task. These remarks are not the impressions only of the present writer. The verdict of history is almost unanimous. Even the Duke of Wellington says, "Lowe was a very bad choice. He was a man wanting in education and judgment." After a few interviews, 6 in all, and those in the first 3 months of his term of office, Napoleon refused to see him, and during the last 5 years of his life they never met. The grievances of which Napoleon complained may be ranged under 3 heads: those relating to title, to finance, and to custody. When Lowe invited Napoleon to dinner soon after his arrival, he addressed him as "General Buonaparte." The Emperor regarded this as an affront. It is impossible to conceive any ground on which his title was disputed. He had been recognized as Emperor by every power in the world except Great Britain, and even England had informally recognized him as Emperor of the French, as also his heirs and successors in perpetuity, in the official documents of the peace negotiations at Chatillon in 1814, which were signed by the plenipotentiaries of all the Allies, including His Majesty the King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. He had been appointed Emperor by the Pope himself, and twice solemnly crowned, once as Emperor and once as King. He had received every sanction which tradition or religion or diplomacy could give to the imperial title. It is difficult to imagine any reason for England's action except that of petty annoyance to a hated foe. The attitude of the British government would be pitiable were it not ridiculous. It seems almost incredible, but it is true, that this contemptible policy did not end even with the Emperor's death. His followers wished to put on his tomb the simple inscription, "Napoleon," with the date and place of his birth and death. But Lowe refused to allow this unless "Bonaparte" was added, so the tomb bore no inscription. Next was the question of finance, which may be treated briefly. Napoleon and his household of 51 persons in all were to cost £8,000, while that expensive luxury Sir Hudson Lowe alone received a salary of £12,000. If the Emperor required anything more he could provide it himself. Although Napoleon's own wants were very simple, the total expenses seem to have been considerably more than double the allowance. Napoleon ordered his silver sold to make up the deficit, and the governor generously increased the allowance to an amount equal to his salary. But Bathurst, his official chief, again cut the amount down to the original sum. All this, however, so far as Napoleon was concerned, was more or less of a comedy. He did not need to sell a single spoon, for he had ample funds at Paris, and even at Saint Helena. He was only trying to show up the meanness of the English government, and in this he succeeded. The last group of grievances related to the question of custody, and in its relation to the health and comfort of the captive, this was by far the most serious of all. The precautions taken to prevent Napoleon's escape would have been ludicrous if the effect on his health had not been so grave. The plateau of Longwood is separated from the rest of the island by a frightful gully which entirely surrounds it, and is only approached by a narrow tongue of land 20 feet broad. In spite of these facts, this pathway was guarded by a regiment of soldiers and a park of artillery. At night the chain of sentries was so close they could almost touch each other. From the signal stations an approaching vessel could be seen at a distance of 60 miles. 2 brigs of war patrolled around the island night and day, and frigates guarded the only 2 landing places, in addition to the impregnable forts. Surely, under these circumstances, Napoleon might have been allowed to keep himself in good health by riding over this barren rock, without the guardianship of a British officer. Later on, when Napoleon was confined to his room by serious illness, the governor issued orders that he must show himself twice a day to the officer on duty. When the Emperor refused, the officer was ordered to peep through the keyhole or the window, to see if the illustrious prisoner had not flown. The result of all this irksome espionage was that after the first months of his captivity Napoleon, who all his life had ridden many miles a day, never mounted a horse, and his health suffered from the lack of his regular exercise. It may be of interest to give here a sort of composite sketch of Napoleon as he appeared at this time to a number of observers, especially as it is the last view we shall have of him. He was about 5 feet 6½ inches tall, stout, but very strongly built, and muscular. His head was well shaped, his hair dark brown without a gray hair among it. His eyes were light blue or gray; his nose finely formed, his teeth good, and his mouth beautiful, his chin round. His complexion was a pale olive color. His hands were small, with tapering fingers and beautiful nails. His limbs were well formed, with a small and well shaped foot. His expression was pleasant, his smile winning, and his manners affable. He wore the uniform of the Chasseurs de la Garde, a green coat with red facings, white waistcoat and breeches, white silk stockings, and low shoes with small oval gold buckles. Over his waistcoat he wore the red cordon of the Légion d'honneur, with the plaque and the cross on his left breast. As to Napoleon's habitation, it was a collection of old one-story cowsheds. It was swept by eternal winds, it was shadeless, and it was damp. The lord of so many palaces, who had also occupied as conqueror so many not his own, was now confined for his private suite to 2 rooms about 12 feet by 14 in size. Each of these rooms had 2 small windows looking towards the regimental camp. In one corner of his bedroom was the small camp bed which Napoleon had used during his campaigns. Between the fireplace and the screen which hid the back door was a sofa on which he passed most of his days. As ornaments of the room there were portraits of Marie Louise and the King of Rome, a miniature of Josephine, and the alarm clock of Frederick the Great, taken from Sans Souci. In the study there were some bookshelves, a writing table, and another bed on which the Emperor could rest in the daytime, or to which he could change at night, when restless or sleepless, as often happened. At Saint Helena the Emperor breakfasted alone at 11, dressed for the day about 2, and dined at various hours from 3 to 7. Soon after his arrival he abandoned his uniform, and generally wore a green hunting coat, but he retained the little cocked hat, although he laid aside the cockade. He passed all his days at the hut, reading, writing, and talking. The one great pleasure of Napoleon's life at Saint Helena was the arrival of a box of books. All through life he was a great reader. At Brienne all of his spare hours were spent in the school library, where he literally devoured Caesar and Plutarch, and developed his admiration for the heroes of antiquity. Later in life he wrote of those joyous hours when he lived among his books, his only friends. As a young lieutenant of artillery at Valence and Auxonne, he read Herodotus, the father of history, then just translated into French, Machiavelli and Voltaire. History was always his favorite, but he also seized upon works of travel, biography, and particularly geography. There is still on file a list of the books he took to Egypt. There were over 300 volumes, nearly half of which were on history; 40 volumes on geography; as many on poetry; and many English novels in French translation, as well as the Bible, the Koran, and so on. As emperor he had made for him a traveling library of 1,000 volumes. To save space, the books were printed on thin paper, without margins, and were bound in flexible morocco covers. They were all packed in boxes lined with velvet, 60 in a box. The list included books on religion, poetry, and the drama, but was mostly made up of history, biography, and memoirs. A box of books was always placed under the seat of his traveling carriage, which was so arranged that it could be made up into a bed at night. There was an overhead light, which enabled the emperor to read at night, and he devoured many volumes as he rolled through the country, throwing out of the window the books he did not care to keep. Wherever he halted for the night, a box was always brought to his room, where he read to pass away his sleepless hours. When he went to Elba, the books he selected from the library at Fontainebleau filled 3 large vans. In addition, he subscribed to all the circulating libraries, and gave a standing order to have sent him all new volumes of historic value as they were published. At Saint Helena, Napoleon asked for some books which he needed, mainly in order to write his memoirs. The English government was graciously pleased to furnish the volumes, but they sent him a demand for the amount paid. The Emperor ordered Bertrand not to settle the account until he received an itemized bill. So, on his death, the books were seized by Lowe and sold in London for less than a quarter of their original cost, some £1,400. As the books all bore traces of his study of them, and were covered with notes in the Emperor's handwriting, which had added greatly to their value, the government by this petty, spiteful policy lost to the nation a priceless collection which should have been preserved in the British Museum. Napoleon hated writing, and what he did write was almost illegible. But he liked to dictate, and sometimes did so for half a day at a stretch, only stopping occasionally to read over what had been written. Shorthand was then practically unknown, and his poor secretaries had much difficulty in keeping pace with his rapid dictation. Worst of all, when wakeful he dictated all night, and Gourgeot would be sent for at 4 in the morning to take the place of the exhausted Montelon. Besides reading and dictation, Napoleon had few distractions. He stayed so much indoors that he became ill from the lack of exercise, so the last year of his life he took up gardening. Paul de la Roche painted a portrait of him in his garden, wearing red slippers and a wide-brimmed straw hat, spade in hand, resting from his labors. He sometimes played a game of billiards, at which he was not expert, or of chess, in which he was far from skillful. As he did not like to be beaten, it severely taxed the courtliness of his suite to let him win. At cards he always cheated, but refused to take the stakes he thus won. Of the last days of Napoleon we know but little. Notwithstanding the atmosphere of surveillance in which he lived, his death was not expected, and the end came suddenly. During the first weeks of 1821, his disease made rapid progress, but even his physician did not realize that it was mortal until a few days before his death. He became faint and weary, lay upon his bed or reclined on his sofa all day, and gave up his dictating. He could hardly retain any food, and lost flesh perceptibly. On the 15th of April he dictated his testament to Montelon. In this he distributed among his most faithful followers the 6,000,000 francs he had deposited with his Paris bankers, also some souvenirs. For the last 2 days of his life he was constantly delirious. He yielded his last breath on the 5th day of May at 10 minutes before 6 in the evening. A terrible storm was raging outside as the soul of the exile took flight. The violent wind shook the frail huts of the soldiers, and tore up the trees that the Emperor had planted. The autopsy, which was performed at his own request, showed that he had died of a cancer of the stomach, the same disease which carried off his father and so many members of his family. All the other organs were sound. After being embalmed, his body was clothed in the familiar green uniform, and lay in state for 4 days. After death the superfluous flesh sank away, and all were struck with the serene and beautiful expression of the face, which recalled the early days of the Empire. The funeral took place with all the pomp that the island could afford. The coffin, on which lay the sword and the cloak he had worn at Marengo, was borne with full military honors by British grenadiers to a spot chosen by the Emperor himself. The grave had been dug under 2 large weeping willow trees in a secluded valley not far from Longwood. In his will Napoleon had said, "Je désire que mes cendres reposent sur les bords de la Seine, au milieu de ce peuple français que j'ai tant aimé." 19 years later, a French frigate, the Belle Poule, under the command of Prince de Joinville, anchored at Jamestown. In response to the universal desire of the nation, King Louis Philippe had sent his son to convey back to France the Emperor's remains. On this last pious pilgrimage there returned to Saint Helena, Bertrand and Gourgeot, the young Lacaze, and Arthur Bertrand, the first French visitor who entered Longwood without Lord Bathurst's permission. There, too, were Marchand, the valet, as well as St. Denis, and 3 others of the Emperor's faithful attendants. They found that Longwood had reverted to its former use and again become a stable. At midnight on the 15th of October, 1840, the 25th anniversary of his arrival at Saint Helena, the party gathered around the Emperor's grave. When, after 10 hours' strenuous labor, the coffin was finally opened, they beheld once more the well-known features unaltered and unimpaired. On a bitter December day, the dead conqueror made the most majestic of his entrances into his capital. Mounted upon a stately funeral car, escorted by the aged veterans of the Old Guard, his body was borne in triumph down the beautiful avenue of the Champs Elysées, under his Arc de Triomphe, across the Place de la Concorde, and over the Seine to the Invalides. Here the King of the French, surrounded by the royal family and all the dignitaries of state, awaited the arrival of the illustrious dead. Suddenly a chamberlain appeared at the door and broke the silence with the announcement, "L'Empereur," and the assembly arose with a common emotion as the body was borne slowly in. Under the gilded dome of the Invalides the spirit of the great Emperor still reigns. His tomb is the first spot to which the visitor to Paris turns his steps. In an open circular crypt directly under the dome, one sees the massive sarcophagus of red Finland porphyry. Like sentinels around the tomb, stand 12 colossal victories in Carrara marble, beside which are trophies composed of 60 standards taken from the enemy. In the mosaic of the pavement are traced the names of 8 of Napoleon's greatest victories: Rivoli, Pyramide, Marengo, Austerlitz, Jena, Friedland, Wagram, Moskova. Here, under the soft blue light of the dome of the Invalides on the banks of the Seine, in the midst of the French people he loved so well, repose for all time the ashes of the greatest soldier the world has ever known. End of Chapter 22.